At this point, ladies and gentlemen, we will now start with the third plenary session on securing submarine cables in the South China Sea. Mr. Chair, Dr. Francis Domingo, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Good afternoon. The mic is working. Excellent. Right. Good afternoon. I'm Francis Domingo. I'm faculty member of University of the Philippines, Diliman. We acknowledge that this is a challenging time right after lunch, so we appreciate your patience as well as your attention as we go on to this panel. So let me introduce our brilliant panel for this really crucial topic, right? Let me get the topic first. Securing submarine cables in South China Sea, which is quite niche, as we've been discussing since yesterday. So our first panelist is, Ms. Katja Bego from Chatham House. She'll be joining us via Zoom in a bit. She is Senior Research Fellow, Chatham House International Security Program, and co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. Our second speaker is Ms. Jane Chan. She's a Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Maritime Security Program at the S. Ratcharajam School of International Studies in Singapore. Our third speaker is Ms. Elena Noor. She's a Senior Fellow at the Asia Program at Carnegie, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia. And our fourth speaker, and we have four, is Dr. Su Wai Moon, is a research fellow in the Oceans Law and Policy at the Center for International Law, National University of Singapore. So at this point, to ensure that we have time for all panelists as well as the question and answer, I'll allow Ms. Katja Begov joining us online to deliver her remarks.
Sorry, well, I did the classic Zoom error. Sorry.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good afternoon for you. Good morning from me from London. So it's a great honor to join you today, and sincere apologies that I couldn't be there in person and had to join remotely. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. So I've been asked to start off with a brief sort of overview session, perhaps talking a bit about the threat landscape surrounding submarine cable infrastructure, zooming in on some of these recent key incidents that really propelled this topic sort of to the mainstream or to global headlines, and then speak a bit as well about how we've seen governments respond to when it comes to their protection, and specifically taking some of those examples that we've seen around the world and how they apply to the context of the South China Sea. So as Professor Domingos already mentioned, this is a bit of a niche topic, so I figured I would give a very brief, because for many of you in the room, it's probably quite familiar, but a bit of an introduction of what we're speaking about, actually, when we speak about submarine cables. So this is an increasingly key infrastructure, and even more so for island nations, of course. So upwards to 99% of international data travels through, international exchange travels through these submarine cables, underpin a lot of critical service from the global banking system to key military system, most communications, etc. There are currently some 600 such cables worldwide, and a significant number of which also route through the South China Sea, with the Philippines especially also emerging as a key landing hub for submarine cables in the region as well. It's a significant topic, a lot of geopolitical tensions around them. So I would say that up until quite recently, the past few years, these cables were very much an invisible infrastructure, if you will, that very few people, kind of among the general public, but also among policymakers, were really very aware of. So this is in part, I would say, sort of a function of this idea of sea blindness, that there's generally quite little awareness, especially in not very kind of maritime nations, about anything to do with the seas and the oceans. but also the fact that we don't really tend to think much about infrastructures until they break. And that's unfortunately now entered an era where we see that happen quite a bit more. So I think what that has meant, that this sort of lack of attention from kind of policy community has meant that that they've now had to relearn a lot of these skills, because up until quite recently, still really a lot of the maintenance, repair, questions around security of submarine cables were really a matter for the private sector, especially in the Cold War era. Before then, a bit more complex. Now this has now really changed, and we see a lot of interest, particularly in regions where some of these cable incidents have taken place, on a policymaker front, about becoming more involved in this kind of trying to think about some of these threats to the system. So we've had a number of quite noteworthy incidents all across the world, really from the Arctic, Baltic Sea, South China Sea, some incidents in the Red Sea, a bit different in nature, but similarly saw damage to large numbers of cables at the same time. And what this has done is that I think this has really propelled the issue of cable protection to the top of the agenda in quite many countries now. So, for example, in Europe, we see several countries now have really developed strategies around cable protection. For example, in the UK, where I am based, recently launched a strategic defense review, of which submarine cable protection was a really massive area of focus. See the same in Japan, Australia, etc. I think what's interesting about this as well is that this has involved a lot of learning and relearning of kind of knowledge that was basically forgotten when it comes to kind of government matters of this kind, basically since the Cold War. So I think we see a lot of need for capacity building and also shared learnings around the world around this issue. So to give you a bit brief overview of sort of the threat landscape, or what we're talking about when we say kind of threats to the cable network. So before that, and I'm sure many of you have heard these statistics as well, if you've been involved a bit with cable protection topics, is that it's important to stress that the vast majority of faults, of incidents involving damage to cables, are actually, not the product of deliberate sabotage. So there's somewhat around 200 faults every year worldwide. Actually, South China Sea and kind of Asia in general is a bit more fault prone than other areas. But the vast majority of these faults are the product either of accidental human damage, so think here of like fishing vessels accidentally scraping their anchor or kind of their nets over cables that exposed or kind of punctured in where they're buried. Think here also of kind of natural disasters, so things like typhoons or seismic activity, which can damage cables. Now, in general, the private sector has been quite good at protecting or kind of repairing cables when they do break, or putting in place a system that can make sure that when cables go down, they can be repaired pretty quickly. There are some weaknesses in those systems, which I'm sure we'll discuss more during the panel as well, but this is something that has worked. What hasn't worked as well, as I would say, is now that we have this kind of new geopolitical dimension to a lot of matters related to submarine cables, is having industry work together with governments around this, or having kind of industry be ready to respond to some of these geopolitical threats. Because even though there are few of them, there's only maybe a handful of incidents, and I'll get into some of them, where there is the question of that there have been sabotage involved. In none of those cases did we have hard evidence, with some exceptions. But they're quite a paradigm shift, I would say, when it comes to thinking about cable protection. So when I say kind of threats to the network, what do I talk about? So I think this session will be primarily speaking around topics to do with sort of sabotage, or both kinetic, perhaps a bit of cyber sabotage as well. And what that means is really countries either operating in the gray zone, for example, using commercial vessels to damage cables that are out there on the seabed. We could see some more kind of in a potential wartime scenario, see something a bit larger scale and more kind of traditional military kinds of, say, detonations or explosions, placed on cables, that sort of thing. So there is a wide range of options in which you can sabotage cables that look a little bit different, whether it's in a gray zone or in a more traditional kind of conventional war scenario. What is important to note is that though the recent examples that we've seen of sabotage have been very much in the gray zone, if they were in fact cases of sabotage, but that it's this topic as well around preparing for sabotage or kind of damage to cables in a more traditional wartime scenario is a very important topic. It's not something we've seen really at scale since both World War I and World War II, but in both of those wars, this was a really large priority, and I would expect also if we would see a kind of more conventional escalation, especially one with a naval component, that cable sabotage would be part of that. So other things, risks or threats that we see to cables, also, but most of these have a significance to the South China Sea, is concerns about interference with cables, so cable tapping, if you will. So this could mean, there's some controversy around how this would work technically, but we see growing concerns about having cables land in certain countries. We may then be able to tap into the data that travels through them. See concerns about supply chains as well. Are there ways to build backdoors into cable or kind of the linked infrastructure, landing stations, etc.? And this has become a reason, for example, for the United States to block some cables that were due to land, for example, in Hong Kong, about concerns that maybe kind of sensitive data of US citizens could be perhaps, end up in places where the US government didn't want that to happen. And a similar topic, which I know some of you next speakers will speak about as well, is some of these ideas around weaponization of permitting and kind of using some of these abilities that countries have to allow cables to be laid in, say, their territorial waters, to be kind of used as a tool to make wider sovereignty claims or to make it impossible to lay cables in countries' waters. And this is a particularly large issue in the South China Sea as well. And what all of this means is that we're just moving into an environment of a lot of less trust than there used to be kind of in the post-Cold War era. A lot less collaboration as well, with concerns, can we trust a repair ship from a country that we might not have a very good relationship with? And then maybe even in the longer run, that's not yet happening, but even bifurcation or kind of split of the network into separate parts. So I'd say this is the overall threat landscape. Really briefly, because I don't want to speak too long, to tell you about some of these incidents that we've seen recently in the Baltic Sea. So I know the next speakers will very much focus on some of the South China Sea examples and context. So I thought it would be interesting to bring in some of these European examples, because we see a lot of parallel dynamics and trends that I think are quite relevant for both. So we've seen in the past 2 years, so starting in October 2023, three successive incidents involving commercial ships doing quite widespread damage to multiple communications cables at the same time within the Baltic Sea, as well as some energy infrastructure, etc., in the process as well. So all three of these incidents sparked a lot of international attention, and I'm sure that many of you have heard of them as well. A lot of government response around their protection. All of these three incidents also had a remarkable degree of kind of a parallel trend to it, if you will. So each of these three ships were commercial vessels. Each of these three ships used their anchor to drag, for a long time over the seabed and damaged quite a lot of infrastructure in their wake. All three of them claimed that this was an accident. All three of them have in fact not really led to any kind of prosecutions because of a very difficult legal environment and kind of accountability around this. Each of the three ships either left from Russian ports or were on their way to Russian ports. What's the interesting bit here as well is that one of the ships, the Eagle S, was probably a shadow fleet ship flagged under the Cook Islands flag, links to Russia, but the other two ships, New Polar Bear, Hong Kong flagged, Chinese owned at the time, Yipeng 3, Chinese flagged, Chinese owned ship, which has sparked some conversations about what that means, or if there's sort of links with similar incidents that have happened elsewhere, for example, near Taiwan. Again, very important to stress, none of these have led to prosecutions. None of these incidents are definitely cases of sabotage. They may have been accidents. They look like accidents in many ways. We see incidents like this all the time that are in fact accidental. It's just what has sparked a lot of debate around this in Europe is the nature of the ships, the pattern, the nature of the kind of anchor drags as well, which were in all three cases really rather long, as well as sort of that this is all happening in the Baltic Sea, which is of course a significant geopolitical hotspot. So to give some trends for, I think, our next discussion around sort of what some of these incidents have in common and what we can learn from them. And this doesn't just apply to these incidents in the Baltic Sea, but also ones that we've seen, for example, near Taiwan. And on the earlier slide, an image of a recent cable cut to the cables that were cut to the Matsu Islands off of the coast of Maine in China, which were similarly, in that case, kind of damaged by a sand thrasher, which basically took out connectivity to the Matsu Islands for several weeks. Matsu Islands only have 2 cables connecting to them, which means they're quite vulnerable to this kind of incident, which means that you could really kind of throttle out connectivity, which is not something that, for example, happens in the Baltic Sea. There's a lot more redundancy, a lot more cables, so even if a couple get damaged, other traffic can be diverted. So in any case, so we've had a number of incidents around the world shared a similar modus operandi. Commercial vessels looked like an accident. Out of these cases, we've had relative lack of accountability. Taiwan has sent 1 captain to prison for this. Some others have been charged with neglect, but a lot of these cases have been really difficult to prosecute because of the kind of difficult legal context that we'll be speaking about. And the fact that the ships involved could kind of hide or maybe speak the truth about this idea of plausible deniability or implausible deniability. It could hypothetically have been an accident, right? So it's hard to prove that it's not. And another kind of complicating factor is that there is this just lack of consensus that sabotage was involved. For example, we zoom into these Baltic incidents, even within Europe, industry and a lot of the research community are very much convinced these were not cases of sabotage, but routine accidents. There's divergence between the different governments and intelligence services involved, with some of the countries in the region much more convinced these were cases of sabotage. Some of the other NATO members not so convinced. So that also makes it difficult to act because there's not really consensus between the different countries involved, which even if they turned out to be accidents means there's always this lingering doubt, at least in some of them. And this thing, which is maybe interesting to mention, is this sort of strangers on a train dynamic. So we've had these incidents in the Baltic Sea in 2 cases involved in ships clearly linked to China. And then we've also had some incidents in the South China Sea with Russian vessels being present that may have been kind of mapping infrastructure that were behaving suspiciously. There's no damage done by them, but there is some sort of, at least to some in the research community and national security community, that implies a degree of cooperation, potentially. Now, I've been speaking for a very long time, and I had a slide with some of the emerging responses that we see in Europe, but I don't want to overrun and then eat too much time, so I can also leave this for now and come back to this. But basically, this slide shows some of the examples of the kind of interventions that we're starting to see in Europe as they're kind of learning by doing and starting to mount a response to this that kind of combines both ways to deter these kind of attacks and to kind of strengthen the infrastructure to begin with by bringing more redundancy, hardening infrastructure, etc. But I can come back to this a bit later. Thank you. So I think I will leave it at this then, and then thank you, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Or the development of the topic of submarine cables or security of submarine cables in Southeast Asia, the evolution of the discussion, and how we end up with the ADMM concept paper that was adopted just last week in Kuala Lumpur. So I'll do that in 3 parts, right? 3 broad parts. First, of course, is my own observation in running a maritime security program out of Singapore and tracking, right, the discussion on CUI, critical undersea infrastructure. And this is done both in the domestic and regional context, to how CUI is being introduced in track 1.5 and track 2 discussion. And third, I'll talk a little bit about that new concept paper that was adopted at ADMM. So first on the evolution of the discussion, I remember Professor Robert Beckman, who is from the Center of International Law in Singapore, a colleague of Sue, who is also an advisor to the Maritime Security Program I run at the S. Rajaratnam School. He raised this topic more than a decade ago, right? Coming to one of our work plan meetings saying that we ought to be looking at this particular topic. And naturally, right, those of us in Southeast Asia, you remember a decade ago, it's not a key priority topic, not top 3, not top 5, not even top 10. Okay, so, internally, the kind of question that we were asking then was, while we understand just how important cables are in terms of communication, connectivity, the prevailing concerns about, cuts in cables then were really accidental. They were mainly, not sabotage, cut by accidents, by natural disaster, occasionally a shark bite here or there, right? And then some of the key question that we ask domestically is, who is in charge of keeping the cable safe, right? We know who is laying them, right? We know who is in charge of giving permits for repairs. Usually agencies are in charge of telecommunication. But who has the jurisdiction, right? Who has the jurisdiction to investigate and apprehend the perpetrators? The ships, right? Not so much the shark part of this. And then, the focus of the discussion was on the role of the industry. And there was discussion, again, this is still a decade ago, discussion about how there ought to be mechanisms or platforms for industry to sit down together with the littorals and to sit down with, enforcement agencies to discuss about this particular topic. But at that time, the main grouses, right, that we hear from the industry was really the delay in getting permits to send ships for repairs and stuff like that. And this can take weeks, sometimes up to months, while the users, some of us, will be suffering very slow or no connectivity in that sense. Then there was a discussion about how there's a lack of, capacity. There's lack of repair ships available in the region. So in my mind, the frequency and the depth of the discussion, really went on an upward trajectory ever since the new polar bear incidents in the Baltic. So while the incidents of damage, as I mentioned earlier on in Southeast Asia, are still mainly, even today, predominantly caused by accident, I think the new polar bear incident reminded us that COI are vulnerable to deliberate and malicious targeting and sabotage. So then the discussion, started going back to how, if we track back to previous World War, as Katya mentioned earlier on, cable cutting is and can be viewed as a precursor to war, right? And more contemporary issue about tracking shadow fleets and underwater unmanned system being utilized to target cables, right? So depending on which circuit you are active in, right? Especially, the conversation for CUI in the legal circuit, right, is about laws, rules, and regulations, focusing on jurisdiction, who has jurisdiction, focusing on attribution. So of course, the discussion on how the captain of the new polar bear is now charged in Hong Kong, that was also, being discussed. On another level, the discussion on the law is leaning towards the laws of armed conflict, right? So this is about the debate on neutrality, what constitutes the use of force, what makes legitimate target in time of war, and the correlating self-defense mechanisms and measures. And of course, relevant to the South China Sea, these days the discussion is about how new cables in the region are circumnavigating the 9-dash line and the bifurcation of cables. So at the track 2 and academic level, there is actually a very vibrant conferencing workshop kind of circuit right now in Southeast Asia. Most recently at the Center of International Law, where Sue belongs to, they had a very big conference, right? A very big law conference, and I see both Elena and Sue were speaking at that particular conference, and a few others in the conference here as well. And and my school, RSIS, in collaboration with the Republic of Singapore Navy during IMDEX, which is the International Maritime Security Conference, we hosted a fireside chat on CUI as well, and that was done in collaboration with King's College. And starting this year, we started using CUI scenarios for what we call the Regional MASEC Practitioner Program, where we bring together more than 100 international naval officers, maritime law enforcement agencies, to discuss, have a tabletop exercise. And naturally, a key takeaway from that kind of exercise, at least, having done this for the first time in Southeast Asia, is that, most countries, most agencies don't have standard SOP in terms of reporting, in terms of who is supposed to respond. So, I believe this has kind of opened our eyes to, what more we have to discuss in the region, and how much more we can learn from our European and Baltic friends, right? So in short, the discourse on security of CUI submarine cables in specific is getting more vibrant, but the regional processes, right, the regional ASEAN processes is running on a very different pace. But I'm still quite impressed, given that we now have an ADMM concept paper, quite impressed by ASEAN standard, how quickly the topic catch on within the ASEAN processes. Backstreading is here. Back we remember in 2004, just last year, when you hosted the Maritime Cooperation Forum, right, at the sidelines of, actually during the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit. I spoke about, how submarine cables and CUI could be an avenue for cooperation between ASEAN and Australia. But you might not remember, the first question that I got from the conference was actually from a senior official from ASEAN asking me, how do you define critical? Right, so just 1 year ago, those were the type of discussion, and today we see a whole series of ASEAN concept paper. We see the foreign ministers, coming up with statements about how important critical infrastructure is, submarine cables are. So again, commendable to the ASEAN processes. It means that, when all 11 countries are on board on a particular topic, ASEAN can do it quite quickly. So now a few words on that concept paper that was adopted in Kuala Lumpur last week. I just checked this morning, it's still not on the ADMM website, but I was told that it will be uploaded later this week. So the purpose of the concept paper is really to raise awareness, right? It was to raise awareness as an emerging domain relevant to ASEAN defense establishment, and it suggested possible ways forward for cooperation, not just amongst ASEAN member states, but also with dialogue partners, right? So the paper spoke of CUI disruption as an increasing concern, and the regional countries need to do more to protect and secure them. It was also clearly stated that in the paper that the defense establishments are still looking. They are still looking towards their economic and telecom sector as a regional lead on efforts to protect CUI, and the security and defense establishment may provide complementary support where appropriate, and which are the sectors that are appropriate. So the guidance, it spoke about leveraging on maritime domain awareness, spoke about the strong info sharing linkages that the defense and security sector have, spoke about how potentially they can be sharing of maritime and air asset to contribute to efforts to address threats to CUI. So there's a long list, right? From introduction of CUI to mill-to-mill talks at the mill-to-mill platform, even at the ADMM Plus expert working group. Potentially this is going to be a topic, and not just one, but all three. So MASEC, cyber, CT, right? Counterterrorism. There's going to be joint exercises and TTXs, and of course, using of existing info sharing platform, for example, the Information Fusion Center in Singapore and the ADI, so the ASEAN Direct Comms Infrastructure. So again, to me, it's very encouraging to see that ASEAN has initiated such a strategic discussion in the maritime cooperation, especially bringing in extra-regional partners. But I will leave it at that, and I'll leave it to my fellow panelists to add more substance to the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. May I now invite Elena to deliver her remarks.
Thank you, Francis. And apologies for most, if not all of you, for having to listen to me again today. But I would like to pick up on Katya's and Jane's remarks, and I'd like to offer you two thoughts on where the region is at with the different vulnerabilities. And these two types of vulnerabilities are physical, as well as what I probably inadequately call strategic. Jane has mentioned a few of them. She's done a masterful job of laying out the regional overview. But I'd also like to double-click on the fact that about 70 to 80% of cable faults that occur are actually accidental. And I think this is a really important point that drives home the caution that we need to take in attributing intention behind many of these incidents of damage. The 70 to 80% figure is from the International Committee for the Protection of Cables, the ICPC, which is the authority on all things cable related. And I think Katya, in one of her slides, mentioned that there are some 200 cable faults that happen on average every year. And that amounts to about 2 to 4 times a week, depending on the region. So this is not something that's new. It is, in fact, what has been happening for a really long time. And what we see in the media does not always add up to what is happening underwater. Jane talked about the different communities and the different emphases. So if you belong to, I think, the crowd here, and I'm also involved in this community, the tendency is to, I think, err on the side of speculation, of maybe being overly cautious, and sometimes even accusatory, I would say, about what the types of damages really mean. And so we attribute intention before there are technical investigations that can afford to be done. If you talk to the technical community in the industry, in the cable industry, if in the past they were more wary about talking geopolitics and its overlay on cables, now they are more inclined to do so simply because it actually complicates their job in repairing and securing cables. And the technical community will tell you that a lot of these cable faults are actually due to what they call, quote, external aggression. To us, that sounds really suspicious, but external aggression in technical speak is really just any fault that is not internal to the cable itself. And that can be through accidental damage, through anchor drags, even through natural disasters like underwater earthquakes. And so if this term, external aggression, were reported in the media, I think there would be a fair amount of sensationalism around it. So all this to say, I think we need to temper some of our discussion around cable faults because there is a discrepancy in what is discussed in the security community and in the media versus what is discussed in the technical community. Now, to get back to these vulnerabilities, so Southeast Asia, as all of you know, we are a bit obsessed with digital transformation, and we rely on these cables to deliver these digital transformation projects. No cables, no internet, no data centers, everything falls apart. And this is why cables are really important to governments, but also to other stakeholders in the region. That said, I think the unique maritime geography and the underwater topography of Southeast Asia results in a lot of these natural vulnerabilities. So I talked a little bit about some of this underwater activity, including, for example, underwater sedimentation that gets really intense with the changing climate patterns as a result of the climate crisis that we're facing today. So what happens on the water also affects what happens underwater. These typhoons, we're in the middle of typhoon season here in the Philippines, these typhoons are getting more ferocious. That can mean greater underwater sedimentation flows underwater, which can result in damages to the cables. In the past, the cables that were buried in this region around the early 2000s, they were buried in the seabed at around 1 meter or less. And so what that means is the older cables that we have in this region are therefore more susceptible to these natural or induced or human-induced vulnerabilities. A lot of the sand dredging that happens for the building of artificial islands in and around this region also contributes to some of the vulnerabilities that cables face in this region, because once you start destabilizing the sand underwater, you're also changing the seabed and therefore opening up this vulnerability to greater cable damage. And geohazards actually account for at least 1/3 of cable breaks in Southeast Asia. Right? So landslides, seismic activity, underwater sedimentation. There is a lot of talk about deep sea mining that's happening, mainly out in the Pacific. But this deep sea mining also has real and serious implications for the resilience of underwater cables. Because again, if you mess around with the seabed, you're going to find out later on, to paraphrase a popular phrase. And I think we've seen quite a lot of these incidents of both natural and induced damage that has resulted in cable breaks in the region. Sometimes these cables are damaged or they're just worn out simply because of age. So Vietnam, for example, in February 2023, lost connection through its underwater cables in almost all 5 of its underwater cables simply because they were really old. So a lot of these cables are beginning to be replaced. There are also new cables that are being laid. Jane talked about the rerouting of some of these cables away from the South China Sea through, for example, the Java Sea. This has resulted in some benefits to countries in the region, because what that means is landing stations in places like Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam. But it also opens up, I would argue, a second kind of vulnerability, the strategic vulnerability that I mentioned up front. And a lot of this, of course, is because of the geopolitical overlay resulting from media reports around what's happening in the Baltic Sea that then gets transposed to what's happening in the South China Sea, what may or may not happen actually in the South China Sea. A lot of the tensions around the South China Sea are resulting in these cable reroutes, which means more expensive costs, higher costs for both the cable providers, but also ultimately for us as consumers of the cable services. What also I think needs to be flagged in terms of this strategic vulnerability is the ownership structure of these cables. Because securing submarine cables doesn't only mean a physical method of securing the resilience of these cables. It also means ensuring the agency of countries in the region of how they can own, manage, and govern the cables that service our people in this region. If you look at the ownership structure, it's changing quite dramatically. Between 2019 to 2023, there was some 23% of cables that were owned by hyperscalers, right? So these are your big tech companies that not only are increasingly having ownership of the cables, the critical underwater infrastructure, but they also own the data centers that are connected to these cables, and they also obviously provide the cloud services that are run by these data centers. So that's almost complete market control of essentially critical infrastructure and services that we rely on for our daily lives, the internet. Now, what does this mean for Southeast Asia? It means a changing way of conducting business. Because now not only do we have to think about purely commercial decisions with a geopolitical tint, a very heavy tint at that, but it also means taking into account things like national security arrangements that are paired up with these commercial decisions that are going to possibly, if we're not careful, lock us into long-term geopolitical alignment one way or the other for the next 2 to 3 decades. Because ultimately we're talking about infrastructure. And this is not a 5 to 10 year sort of plan. This is a 20 to 30 year type of strategic consideration. I'm going to end with a recall of history. We talked about I think some were quite dismissive over the role of history in the first panel, but I think it's really important for us in this region to think about how we've been central, we meaning Southeast Asia, has been central to the spread of not only telegraph cables, but now fiber optic cables in the modern day. And we are not new to this geopolitical competition, even over cables, because in the past, the lines, the telegraph lines that connected the British strait settlements of Singapore to Penang, onwards to Madras, now Chennai in India, all formed part of the British All Red Line telegraph. This then obviously spread outwards to the rest of the British Empire. And we were a key part of that, not only in terms of being networked to the pursuits of empire, but we also supplied the natural resources that enabled that expansion of empire. There was a particular type of latex from a specific species of tree, the gutta percha. And this tree was almost decimated. There was huge ecological devastation because the latex from gutta percha was used to insulate the telegraph cables that basically covered the whole British empire of telegraph cables. And so the expansion of this dominion came at great cost to us. And I think this is a really important reminder for Southeast Asia to take into the future, because if we're not careful, we are going to once again be at the heart of this geopolitical tug of war. And this time, we shouldn't be at the sacrificial end of it. So I'll just end there on that slightly depressing note.
Right. Thank you, Elena. Now we'll have our last speaker, Sue.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank KAS Philippines for having me again. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And this is my third time in the Philippines. I was in Bohol, Philippines for ADMM Plus Maritime Security Conference where I discussed CUI protection. I have the slides. I cannot see it here, sorry, in front of me. Right, so I have been speaking about this at different occasions and forum and discussions, and always have to think, how can I make something, say something different from each event to another event. So I was asked to speak about advancing multilateral and regional cooperation and for the protection of submarine cables in South China Sea. So for my presentation, I will have 4 key points. First, I'm going to start with what UNCLOS provides, the fundamental framework for the protection of submarine cables and the gaps in terms of law enforcement. And the second point is, which has been emphasized many times by other panelists as well, that public-private partnership. What exactly is this? How can we do this? And submarine cables in South China Sea, and what would be the way forward? Because it's been quite overwhelming. There have been several issues talking about cables. Private industry is also involved. So what do we do? What could be the practical way forward? What would be the low-hanging fruit if a country really take this issue seriously? And these infrastructures are really critical for national interest. What can we do, and where do we start? So these are the points that I'm going to cover. And this is the illustration for the maritime zones. And we have the baseline, just to give a bit of visual for the maritime delimitation. From the baseline, we have 12 nautical miles, seaward side, territorial sea. And for this purpose of presentation, we're going to focus on territorial sea, exclusive economic zone from the baseline, 200 nautical miles. and then seabed and subsoil of the submarine areas from the baseline 200 nautical miles and beyond 200 nautical miles is the high seas and the area. So for UNCLOS on protection of submarine cables, coastal states, so we are going to look at two main actors where the coastal state, which has different maritime zones, and the other states, the states who's going to lay cables within these maritime zones. So coastal states' rights to regulate cables and pipelines and the obligation of states to protect these cables depend on where they are located, in which maritime zones they are located, and when the damage occurred, where the damage occurred, the location of the damage. So based on that, coastal state jurisdiction varies. To what extent coastal state can exercise jurisdiction. So for maritime zones subject to sovereignty are territorial sea and archipelagic waters, and maritime zones outside sovereignties are exclusive economic zone, continental shelf, high seas, and deep seabed. So key actors under UNCLOS relating to submarine cables, the coastal states and other states or third states, which are cable laying states. But in practice, UNCLOS gave the right give states to lay cable, the right to the states to lay cables, but in practice, states are not laying the cables, but private companies are laying the cables. And sometimes not just one company, a consortium of private companies own the cables and lay the cables, not the states. So when we start thinking about laying a new cables, based on the UNCLOS provisions, do we require consent from the coastal state, thinking from the cable industry perspective? So if it's within territorial sea and archipelagic waters, yes, we do need the consent from the coastal state, and all the activities, laying of the cables or maintenance of the cables, all the activities relating to the cables has to be will be the subject to coastal states' relevant laws and regulations on protection of cables. So this is why, because coastal states exercise sovereignty in those waters, with one exception, in territorial sea, the right of innocent passage. So basically, if it's within the coastal state, territorial sea, cable laying companies require the consent of the coastal state. But in the exclusive economic zone, they have the right to lay cable, but must give due regards to the rights and duties of coastal states, and the consent is not required. And same for the continental shelf. They have the right to lay cables, but must give due regard to cables and pipelines which are already in position. And same for the high seas, the consent is not required, and right to lay cables and pipelines is one of the high seas freedoms. So this is what UNCLOS provides. If we implement UNCLOS exactly as it is, this is how it works. But in reality, different state practice we have. Some of the countries still requires cable laying companies to also acquire the permits for laying of cables even beyond the territorial sea. And for another provision under the UNCLOS, which is important, particularly to take actions or to enforce the law when the cable is being damaged, is Article 113. So Article 113 requires every state to adopt the laws and regulations which is necessary to provide that the breaking or injury by a ship flying its flag or by a person subject to its jurisdiction of a submarine cable beneath the high seas done willfully or through culpable negligence to interrupt or obstruct telegraphic or telephonic communications shall be a punishable offense. So basically this article requires all the member states to adopt the national laws criminalizing intentional damage to submarine cables. But in reality, many countries have not implemented this provision effectively. And also, this provision shall also apply to conduct calculated or likely to result in such breaking or injury. So, for example, sometimes they are not intentionally aiming to damage the cables, but because of their conduct, there is a cable protection zones, or no anchor zone. They know it, it's really clear sign, but they still proceed with anchoring and eventually damage the cables. That particular act can also be considered an offense. And does Article 113 applicable to EEZ as well? Yes, based on Article 58.2. So if we want to implement this Article 113, how does it look like? So let's say State A, it's a party to the UNCLOS, and we would like to implement Article 113. So prescriptive jurisdiction, which is to have the national legislation, to adopt the national legislation, which criminalize intentional damage to the cables. That's prescriptive jurisdiction. So does this law applicable within the territorial sea? Yes, it's prescriptive jurisdiction. In the exclusive economic zone, this law still apply. High seas still apply. But if we want to implement Article 113 for the coastal states, there is a limitation. Coastal states can only enforce such law only within territorial sea. But beyond territorial sea, jurisdiction is only with the flag state and the state where perpetrators are the nationals of that state. So meaning that if a vessel damaged the cables and we have a clear evidence, only state which has jurisdiction is the state of the vessel. The vessel is flying the flag of state A, that only state A can exercise jurisdiction. And then the captain or the perpetrator of the the national of the perpetrator, for example, the captain of the ship, if the captain is the state B national, then only state B can exercise jurisdiction. So we can see that the limitation of the enforcement powers or enforcement jurisdiction of the coastal state beyond territorial sea, and we have to only rely on the flag state and the national country of the perpetrator. So have we applied these provisions, or do we have some case studies? Can give some examples of this enforcement jurisdiction? Yes. So for coastal state jurisdiction, we can look at this case. A Chinese national has been imprisoned 3 years in prison for damaging an undersea cable connecting Taiwan's mainland and the Penghu Islands in the Taiwan Strait. And for national jurisdiction, beyond territorial sea, it's the cable theft case, Vietnam submarine cables lost and found case 2007. And total of 10 people were arrested, and also they were sentenced 12 years imprisonment. So Vietnam was exercising national jurisdiction because those people who committed the offense were their nationals. And the flag state jurisdiction, currently the Chinese captain is facing the trial before the Hong Kong court. That new plausible captain, and he was sailing under the Hong Kong flag. So Hong Kong exercised flag state jurisdictions and they prosecuted the Chinese captain. So this is how it will look like if we implement Article 113 as it is. So I have this just illustration before I move on to the next point. I'll talk about public-private partnership. The first part was what UNCLOS provides to us. for protection of cables and pipelines. So when we talk about exclusive economic zone, for example, beyond territorial sea, except for the cables, we also have other various activities going on at the moment. So we have marine protected areas, offshore, oil and gas platforms, and there will be people fishing, and now we also have new facilities and infrastructures which are wind farms, for example. So all these activities and cables coexist in these areas. And so it became more crowded, exclusive economic zone, and it is more important now for us to ensure the safety of the submarine cables in these areas. So if we recall the previous clause provisions that private companies are the ones laying the cables, and they don't necessarily require the consent of the coastal state. So it doesn't mean that they will never talk to the coastal state, they will never communicate to the coastal state. We will just lay our cables wherever we want to. We can't really do that. So this is where public-private partnerships and close cooperations between private companies and public authorities of the coastal states is very crucial. So why? Because before laying the cables, cable companies will do their desktop surveys to do this virtual planning of where to lay the cables and mapping. Then after that, they will do the physical route survey, which is physical. So in that case, that if they just decide on their own, we think this area, this route is the best for us, we will proceed with laying of the cables. But later on, we have all other activities going on, and the cables are in fact more risky for cables to get damaged by the other activities ongoing at the same time. But if we communicate with the authorities before they lay the cables, and coastal state authorities can tell them, look, this is the areas that other activities are going on. We have marine spatial planning. So it is better for you all to avoid these areas. So it's a win-win situation, just striking a balance. Both private and public coastal states as well has the interest in doing so, by having close communications. And also during laying cables, that must give due regards to the other activities and also the cables which are already in position in the area. And after being laid, we still want to maintain that they are in good position, nobody is intentionally damaging or accidentally damaging them. And if we could identify who damaged the cables, then we can also take action effectively. So for 3 and 4, after being like monitoring and surveillance, based on my discussion with some of the stakeholders, when there is a damage to the cables, public authorities are normally not informed. They are not aware about it, Coast Guard or the Navy. The cable companies which own the cables is the first person to know there is a damage to the cables. And of course, then after that, they will try to fix it. And sometimes if they need repairs, then it will take many months or many weeks. So they say the only options for them is invest more money, have more redundancy. That's more practical for them at the moment. So they will be very happy if the authorities could speed up the process of the laying and repair permits as well. So this is where the public-private partnership can work together. For example, our public authorities or law enforcement agency may not have the sufficient capability to monitor and secure the existing cables. In that case, if the private companies has the capability, then we could work together and ensure accountability. And of course, at the end is the taking legal action. In order to do that, we need to have legal provisions ready for that. So in fact, working closely with the industry for stages 1 to 3 is very important, and it is always best to prevent damage by taking proactive actions rather than talking about, taking legal actions after we already faced a disaster. So cables in South China Sea, this is the simple map, submarine cables that we all can Google it from telegeography. So this is how it looks, just to illustrate that how dense this area is. We already have several cables being laid, and it's quite congested in South China Sea. And we need to protect these cables from any kinds of threats we may face. So if we look at this, that I was thinking, what could be because I have to talk about cooperation. So how do we motivate for cooperation for the states, especially in the region or ASEAN? So I think let us focus on impact-centric approach rather than looking at who could damage the cable, why cables can be damaged. So as you can see on the left side, there can be intentional damage to the cables, sabotage, terrorism, espionage, theft, hybrid warfare, unintentional fission, natural hazards, anchoring, construction, seabed works, operation error, etc. So there can be the list of risks, the reasons that the cables can be damaged. But if we look at the impact, it's the same, whether it's small country or big country or, even for ASEAN countries, regardless of the countries, the impact is still the same. If there is no communications, then there are real practical impact on us. Immediate technical impact, communication breakdown. If you could just switch off your Wi-Fi, then you can feel it. And latency, reduced bandwidth, and economic and operational impact, all banking transactions and millions and trillions of dollars passing across the ocean every day. And we also have, of course, security impact. So communication is truly crucial for us. So if we could just focus on the impact, we don't want that. It's important for our economy and our security. Then maybe it will be easier for all the states to come on board for the protection of this infrastructure. And the last part of my presentation, the way forward, could be the next step. And we talk a lot about cooperations and coordinations, regional, international. But I have been emphasizing this at different occasions that these coordinations or collaboration need to start at the national level. Because if we don't have the clear policy, clear strategy, in one individual countries, and even if we have a very great regional framework, at the end of the day, there will be no effective implementation. So it is very important for individual countries to have, let's start with implementation of UNCLOS provisions, Article 113, strengthen national legal framework, establish a national coordinating agency for submarine cable governance. So which agency should be in charge for cables? I think many of the countries, especially in the region, may not have a clear answer. It's not only exclusive to the region, in fact, it's a global issue in many other parts of the world as well, that it's very hard to identify. Cables from the beginning to the end, the whole process, agency A is in charge. Most of the countries will not be able to give that answer at the moment. So this is something that we should work on, national coordinating agency, so that when you have an application for a permit for laying of new cables, Agency A can lead and bring all the relevant agencies all together and to make sure that the cables throughout the life cycle are protected. and enhance monitoring and surveillance of cable routes and activities, strengthen this capability with whatever resources we have at the national level, promote information sharing among relevant government bodies, operators, and regulators, develop cooperative mechanisms for efficient laying, maintenance, and repair of cables, and integrate cable protection issues into national maritime security policy or strategies by recognizing cables as critical national infrastructures. So this is my second last slide. So recommendation for ASEAN. I think it's very crucial for us also to protect the cables in region or in the disputed areas in South China Sea, that if we could have something uniform mechanisms, a holistic approach at the ASEAN level, maybe we could work better, we could better protect them in the South China Sea. ASEAN already recognized submarine cables as critical infrastructure. This is an ASEAN, we have ASEAN guidelines for strengthening resilience and repair of submarine cables, which was adopted in 2019. And now we have the working group on submarine cables to facilitate regular exchanges and promote cooperation among ASEAN member states. And the working group is currently enhancing the 2019 guidelines. And also ASEAN could create a model provision implementing Article 113 of the UNCLOS to harmonize national legislation for ASEAN member states. ASEAN could develop an agreement which is preferably legally binding for cooperation for strengthening law enforcement for the protection of submarine cables and pipelines between ASEAN member states, such as coordinated patrol, surveillance, and monitoring. And information sharing is also, of course, very important. And if all the member states could work together for effective law enforcement, establish cooperative mechanisms on monitoring and surveillance. And also, like we have in Europe, this is an idea that we could have ASEAN Subsea Cables Association or Southeast Asian Subsea Cables Association, where public authorities and all the cable laying companies, cable owners, cable producers can all sit at the same table and have regular meetings and exchanges to understand better each other's challenges and work together. And of course, this is also just a suggestion that perhaps with the Philippines chairmanship of ASEAN, we can mainstream COI protection better in perhaps COC discussions. So I'm going to end with this, my favorite quote: if there is a will, there is a way. Of course, will is a goodwill to protect these critical infrastructures, and also a goodwill to not intentionally damage the cables. With that, thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Sue. Yeah, thank you also to the panelists for trying their best to keep the time. So that was to take in. So perhaps before I open it up to the audience for questions, I have just one question for all panelists, right? So in all of your presentations, you were talking about the difference in capacities or even threat perceptions across the region, right? So what is the current state of play? Is it self-help for each state, or is there a collective, it's either private sector or either states, looking at a collective effort to actually secure our submarine cables? Yes, anyone would like to answer? It's great.
Well, I thought the panel kind of alluded to the fact that, the level of cooperation is maturing, right? It's no longer self-help within the different sector. There is a lot more engagement between the industry, the littoral states, and the enforcement agency. The challenge right now, as Sue highlighted, is that not every country has their standard SOP, and then the standard SOP in terms of who is responsible, may not necessarily be the natural counterpart in the other country, right? So the jurisdiction may not lie in the same authorities across the board, and that becomes a bit of a problem at the ASEAN level, because at the ASEAN level, it goes by sectoral body, right? If it is political security, then certain ministries are there, usually defense, and then if it's economy, it's the economy. So right now, I think the challenge really is that, with cable security, is straddling between, two different pillars. But I believe that, looking at the progress that ASEAN has made in the last couple of years, there should be, some sort of means to be able to bring all this together.
Right, thank you. So now we can open it up to give more time for questions to our audience. So if you have a question, kindly raise your nameplate. Yes, thank you very much. Ma'am?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. All the speakers talked from various perspectives. And regarding the protection of undersea infrastructure, there are many factors to be considered, and also they are so various. Function, subject of harmful acts, individual or states, an entity that incurs damage by sabotage. It means stakeholders. It is also various, and responding measures, coping with crimes committed by individuals or self-defense against the use of force or the threat of use of force. All of these factors can be variable. So without focusing upon certain type or certain function of undersea infrastructure, I'm afraid we could not draft general theory on the protection of undersea infrastructure. If I could hear some opinion on this point from any of the speakers, I would be very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That's right. So based on my presentation, the scope is pretty much consider the damage to the cables during the peacetime and what do we do with existing provisions under the UNCLOS for intentional damage to the cables. But I think to have more effective, enforcement jurisdictions for different kinds of damage, and also the actors or the interested parties. I think the ILA that you yourself involved in the ILA committee is doing on that. And probably I hope if we can consider damage to cables as the piracy, then maybe we can have more enforcement jurisdictions can be exercised more effectively. So we have to wait and see that the scholarly community is also working on the development of international law principles for better protection of the submarine cables. But my discussion is pretty much just on what could be the initial state we could do with the threats and security, challenges that we are facing at the moment for the countries in the regions, or also in the South China Sea. I'm not sure if I did answer the questions effectively, but thank you.
Maybe if I could just add, Professor Kanehara, thank you for your question. From the technical standpoint, a cable damage is a cable damage regardless of intention, right? And so for the people who actually have to go and repair these cable damages, for them, they're used to repairing 200 faults a year. And so it's not anything more than just noise to them. And so I don't know if the law can take that into account, but for the people who matter, that is the repairers themselves, it doesn't matter what the intention is.
Oh, Professor, then I'll take since Sue has mentioned about the peacetime discussion, then the discussion on, wartime application and legitimate targets of cable is also very vibrant. I think you were also in that conference where, there's discussion about the review of the San Remo manual and the Newport manual, and that you have officials then, sharing the opinions but these two manuals are just that, right? They are just references. They are not policy by different countries right now. We do need to refer to various different countries, commander's handbook in terms of how they interpret these manuals for wartime. But it meant for a lot more conversations will be required in terms of allowing us to understand, right, how potential adversaries will interpret what they can and cannot do in times of conflict. Thank you.
Great. So I see a number of nameplates, so thank you. That's great. I think I'll collect questions because we do have limited time as usual. So I'll let our two colleagues here first ask questions, and then maybe three at a time. No, please. I think you got first. Pham first, and then Dr. Hayton, and then we have Ascari. Yeah, 3 questions at a time so we can maximize the. Is there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for a very insightful panel. Who knows that submarine cable can be this interesting? My question is submarine cable in the exclusive economic zone. So because there will be a class of jurisdiction between the coastal state and the flag state. So now in the exclusive economic zone, the coastal state have the right to give fishing license to foreign fishing vessel. And what if one of the conditions to obtain that fishing license is to respect the fishing law of that coastal state, including in the case of damaging submarine cable in the EEZ of that coastal state. So if a foreign vessel damages a submarine cable in the EEZ of that coastal state, do they have jurisdiction to enforce their fishing law related to like boarding, detention, and investigating, or even criminalize those foreign vessels? Is there any clash between flag state jurisdiction and coastal state jurisdiction in this case? Thank you.
I think Dr. Hayton, please.
Hello, it's about how you tell the difference between an accidental and a purposeful break. I have heard it said that 99% of accidental breaks take place within harbours or areas of very shallow water. So therefore, if a break takes place outside an area of shallow water, it's intentional. Is that true?
Yes, and last question, at least for the first 3. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
No, just take it through. One more so we can.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, so the question
Yes,
is,
please.
Yes, I'm Ascari from Indonesian Coast Guard. So we talk a lot about the protection of submarine cable. So as one of the countries that travels by so many cables in the region, so we have a different side of the story. So several years ago, both the Navy and the Indonesian Coast Guard has apprehended the cable thief. But nobody came forward as the owner of the cable. And there is no communication damage or communication disturbance because of the cable theft. So my question is there any mechanism to make the owner of the cable to obligate them to remove the cable, the unused cable, because the cable become the garbage, similar like ghost nets. If we have our mining and coal mining in our country, they have to close the land and plant the trees. Is it any similar mechanism, something like that? Thank you very much.
Right, so can we have, for the first, did anyone get the question? The first one? Yeah, Katya as well, if she can, I don't know if she heard the questions, but. Yeah.
Okay, maybe I can just start us off in the interest of time.
Sure.
So, Bill, I have not heard that, and so I don't know if it's an urban legend, or I'd love to get more information from you. But cables that are laid closer to shore these days are better protected. And the cables that are out in the deeper waters are actually thinner and requires less armor. So that would suggest that actually the cable breaks closer to shore. Actually, it doesn't suggest anything. I'm just going to put that there because according to the technical community and industry, it's extremely difficult to intention. There are signs that you may draw from whether a break is intentional or not, but it reminds me, in a sense, of this cybersecurity discussion. How do you attribute something, and how do you attribute intention to a break? And there are different levels of attribution, right? There's political attribution, there's technical attribution, there's legal attribution. And I think it would be cautious for us to wait for the technical investigation to be completed before jumping to any conclusions.
What about the other questions? Yeah.
Right.
Hi.
Fun questions, I think, yeah. So if I understand correctly your questions, do you mean that in the coastal state fisheries law, when we issue the fishing license to the vessels, fishing vessels, we have a conditions not to damage the cables? I'm not sure if any country have done that so far, but just based on my understanding is so far it's a bit, I have never seen any state practice yet, whether it could be done, and maybe it could be a bit still unclear under the international law whether we can do or not. But if we understand it, UNCLOS provisions that coastal states have two specific jurisdictions beyond the territory sea in the EEZ for fisheries, and fisheries is for illegal fishing and the damage to marine environment. So we are now talking about communication cables, but damaging the cables, if something happened to the cables, does it have any effect to the fisheries or fishing resources or the environment? But in the case of pipelines, there is a possibility, if there is a pipeline explosion, there is damage to the marine environment. So in that case, we could, claim jurisdiction because there is an impact, is the damage to the environment. But yeah, it's quite an interesting point, but I don't think we have any, state practice so far. Yes, thank you.
Right, so I'm being advised that we need to end the panel. I'm sorry. So maybe anyone would like to address just one, just quick last.
Okay, to remove and use cables, right? Yeah, I have heard these kind of similar questions at one of the cables conference at CIO as well. But I don't think Law of the Sea Conventions clearly stated anything on that. But I think that's, again, emphasized the importance of effective communications between the cable industry and the authorities. Then if we have close cooperations and mutual understanding, so for the interest of both parties, we can easily detect who is the owner and also ask them to remove the unused cables. Thank you.
Right.
Can I?
Yeah, just Katja, sorry. Yeah, can we have?
So really briefly, just one quick note on the retrieval of cables. It's actually a very interesting topic as well, because there's a lot of discussions. They're generally left on the seabed quite purposefully because it's better for the environment. Because kind of maritime, ecosystems grow on top of them. So that's why there's 140,000 kilometers worth of cable on the seabed, and it's usually encouraged that they stay there. So I think it's an interesting discussion. Maybe now, in the interest of time, I won't delve into too much, but there are some trade-offs there of whether you would want to actually retrieve them.
Great. So it's unfortunate we have to end. So before we end, we'd like to thank KAS Philippines for selecting the panel, our brilliant panelists, and for supporting our organizers as well for managing a conference. So thank you very much for attending the panel, and we look forward to seeing you around. Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, let's give them a round of applause, sirs and ma'ams.
So we will now give everyone a 3-minute coffee break or toilet break. Once you're done, please be back immediately for we will begin the 4th plenary session. Once again, we will be giving everybody a 3-minute toilet or coffee break. Then after which, please be back for the 4th plenary session. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We will begin soon. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We will begin soon. For us to begin with the fourth plenary session, we would like to request everyone to kindly settle down. We will begin soon. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to request everyone to kindly settle down, for we will begin with the fourth plenary session. We would like to request our guests who are still outside the venue to kindly proceed inside for us to begin with the fourth plenary session.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will now start with the fourth plenary session, securing freedom of navigation and the rule of law through cross-regional defense cooperation. Ms. Vina, Dr. Vina. Ms. Vina, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. Colleagues, if I could welcome everyone back, please. I know it's difficult to return after a long day and a coffee break, but we have a panel ahead of us which will be really dynamic, looking at cross-regional defense cooperation and what that can do to reinforce rule of law and freedom of navigation. It will build really nicely on a panel discussion that we had earlier today with the ambassadors and the debates that began about South China Sea as a global commons and what regional cooperation and what extra-regional actors are about. So my name is Veena Najibullah. I'm with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and we are absolutely thrilled to be an institutional partner this year of this Manila dialogue. It's been tremendous to see how successful this event has been so far, and we're very much look forward to the discussions. For this panel, we have really only one presentation by Colin Coe, who will do sort of a scene setting, and then we have four fantastic discussants who will respond and try to keep it as interactive as possible. We recognize that it's late in the day. Half of my panel, including myself, we're all jet lagged, so we will have to keep this interesting just to stay awake ourselves. So we'll try to keep it moving. In terms of, I won't do a long introduction of the bios because that will take an hour, but you've seen their bios in the program. I'll just mention that Dr. Colin Coe is from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, so he'll do the PowerPoint presentation and do the scene setting. Then we have Freddie Ganchun, who's from the Department of Justice here in Manila, Philippines. We have Dr. Sophie Wushuang Yi, who is a research fellow at the Grandview Institution Marine Studies Center in Beijing, and she'll sort of speak more from China's perspective as an international scholar. And then we have Dr. John Hemmings, who's a Deputy Director for Geopolitics at the Council on Geostrategy in London, so bringing a European perspective to the discussion. And then last but not least, Ray Powell, who I'm just forgetting what Ray does. It's a very exciting thing that everybody knows about, but he's the director of the Sea Light project, which, as some people say, is one of the most innovative non-governmental organizations in this space. So with that brief introduction, let me turn to Dr. Koa for his presentation.
Hello. Hi, very good afternoon to all of you while waiting for the clicker to come. Oh, thank you so much. First of all, let me thank the organizers for having me here. This is my second time with the dialogue. Happy to be here again, and this time around able to share my perspectives. I was rather encouraged by the proceedings earlier from the start of the morning because I realized that it's not just the presenter who had to speak a lot, the others have to speak a lot as well. So I will hope that my fellow panelists will share the burden, even though I'm presenting. But what I'm going to do here is simply to lay out a broad, clean canvas full of outlines. And you know outlines are very boring because they are usually black and white. I will urge my colleagues here to add the colors onto it, therefore. So bear with me, I'm going to be a little bit boring with basically what most of you will have known about what I'm going to talk about. But just to scope this presentation a bit, because even though the title talks about cross-regional defense cooperation, which gives the impression that we are talking about forces that belong to the military, I'm going to go beyond that. And I hope that our discussion goes beyond that because we talk about cooperation, we have to necessarily involve not just the military establishments, but we have to involve other security agencies like Coast Guards or other associated agencies as well. So my presentation is going to scope around these entire ambit of what I call maritime forces. Navies, Coast Guards, and other forces that we are interested in. Now, so I have here three main questions that I use to lay out the contours of these entire discussions. It will be meant to do nothing more than just lay out the basic foundation of what we'll have later in the more substantive presentations by my fellow panelists. First question being, how does cross-regional cooperation reinforce international law itself? And I have here a few points